I'm Ghost Ring, and you're watching Appleseed Academy. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith vacated Concord at noon, beginning the retreat along Battle Road to Boston. By this time, the militia outnumbered him and had surrounded Concord. The running battle began about a mile away at a junction of country lanes called Miriam's Corner. Militiamen had been pouring in through these lanes for some time. Now, no one knows exactly what happened there, although there's much speculation. However, this is where the colonists first took aggressive action and continued it all the way back towards Boston. Therefore, Miriam's Corner was the third strike which ignited the war. Recall that the actions at Lexington and Concord were defensive in nature and therefore would have been insufficient to begin a war. However, repercussions and executions would certainly have occurred. The resulting running battle was not the simple-minded battle plan where individuals just fired from behind trees and stone walls, as we've been led to believe. No, it was much more sophisticated than that. After all, these men were well-trained veterans of earlier wars, and they were led by able and experienced officers who had a good eye for the ground, and their training taught them to work in teams, an essential military requirement. This enabled them to set up and execute several well-thought-out ambushes, and they knew to concentrate their fire on British officers. Another stronger ambush awaited them only a mile away at Hardy's Hill, and another occurred a short distance further at the Bloody Ankle. The column of regulars was about a half-mile long, and they would barely clear one ambush when another would occur. New and fresh militia would appear in front of them, and the militia from a previous ambush would run ahead of the regulars to hit them again. After the Bloody Ankle, they encountered an ambush by the Lexington militia led by Captain Parker. Many of his men wore bloody bandages from that morning's battle. That rocky hillside is still remembered as Parker's revenge. Here, Colonel Smith was shot from his horse with a thigh wound, and Major Pitcairn assumed command. Their collapse came a short distance away at Fisk Hill, just outside of Lexington. There, Major Pitcairn was thrown from his horse. Though not wounded, he was apparently shaken so badly that he became useless for a time, and the British column began to come apart. Most of the British had been wounded, and the rest were utterly exhausted. The entire force was nearly out of ammunition, and both sides were consumed with thirst. In fact, deadly fights broke out at wells all along the road. Joshua Simmons, who had thrust his musket into the powder keg at Lexington that morning, threatening to blow up the magazine rather than have it captured, himself captured 2 soldiers and a young fifer, only a child, who'd been shot. Now, he begged Joshua not to kill him, and of course he didn't. But he did die a few days later. Some regulars simply sat down in the road and waited for the end. Now, eventually, the regulars refused to even fire back and began running in fear. Their junior officers got in front of them, threatening them with bayonets. And then, the soldiers began laughing and cheering. They'd seen the relief column of General Percy, who had just arrived in Lexington. Percy observed the pitiful condition of Colonel Smith's men with dismay and realized he had 15 miles to retire back to Boston, and his men only had their 36 rounds of ammunition and only a few rounds for his cannon. Now, he did have a larger force at his disposal now, between 1,800 and 1,900 men, and he was able to arrange them in a better formation for the remaining portion of the retreat, yet the militia had rapidly increased in numbers also, and this would continue throughout the day and into the night. Of utmost importance, the militia also gained a new commander at Lexington, Brigadier General William Heath, who was perfect for the fighting that day. He was assisted by Dr. Joseph Warren. Now, Heath devised a new engagement plan for the militia. They surrounded Percy's force with a moving circle of skirmishers, which operated at long range. This tactic was difficult to maintain, but it was very effective. General Percy himself referred to it later as a moving circle of fire. The heaviest casualties occurred at the village of Monotomy. At Cooper's Tavern, the British found 2 aged gentlemen, Jabez Wyman and his brother-in-law, Jason Winship, both of whom were unarmed, just enjoying a drink. Retreating British soldiers attacked and stabbed them several times, then bashed their heads in, leaving their brains on the floor. Why, they set fire to buildings, killed livestock, and plundered houses and churches. Some even stole a church's communion silver and sold it later in Boston. General Percy was almost killed there, having a button shot off his coat without leaving a scratch. He later told of some of the inhabitants who would conceal themselves in houses and then jump out only 10 yards from the soldiers to shoot at them, knowing full well they would be killed. Percy suffered half of his casualties that day at Monotomy. General Percy considered returning by the same route he'd come, through Cambridge. However, that route had more opportunities for ambush, and he correctly surmised that the bridges over the Charles River had been sabotaged again. Besides, the route was longer, and he couldn't have completed it before nightfall. Therefore, he chose a shorter route, through Charleston. Years later, General Clinton told him that had he not made that choice, the British government in America would have ended that day. Now, some resistance was encountered on this route, but it was overcome with relative ease. The route enabled him to reach a safe place for his exhausted troops to spend the night, Bunker Hill. He could protect this location easily and proceed to Boston the next day. Major Pitcairn and Dr. Joseph Warren and the lone soldier who'd been wounded at Lexington would be killed there just a few weeks later. Now, one colonial unit could have still prevented Percy's column from reaching safety, but its commander, Colonel Timothy Pickering, had been dragging his feet all day and arrived too late to enter the fray. Pickering was acknowledged as a good tactician, and he performed well later during the Revolutionary War. Eventually, he even became the Secretary of War for the new nation. But at this time, he did not want to rebel against the government. Even the day after Lexington and Concord, he was anxious to negotiate a compromise and reconcile with the British. This attitude undoubtedly contributed to his lackluster performance on that important day. General Percy, who had previously considered the militia to be utterly contemptible as a military force, changed his mind that afternoon. He later wrote, "Whoever dares to look at them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. They have men amongst them who know very well what they are about." He later returned to England, disgusted with the way the British were conducting the war. Now, when George Washington received the first reports from that day, he left his fields and gathered his weapons with sadness. He wrote to his friend, "Unhappy it is to reflect that a brother's sword has been sheathed in a brother's breast, and that the once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched in blood or inhabited by a race of slaves. Sad alternative, but can a virtuous man hesitate in his choice?" The day after the battle, John Adams rode along Battle Road, picking his way through the carnage and burial parties and smelling the stench from burned buildings. He later wrote, "Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it." He also said something which is particularly appropriate to today's Americans, his posterity. "Lethargy is the forerunner of death to the public liberty." And this concept has its roots in antiquity. Well, over 2,000 years ago, Plato said, "The price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men." These statements are at the heart of Appleseed's purpose, and modern Americans are ignoring it at their peril. John Adams' cousin, Samuel Adams, who was a real firebrand before and during the war, also spoke eloquently about his love of freedom and his disdain for those who were more tepid about it in the Revolution. "If ye love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude better than the animated contest of freedom, go home from us. We ask not your counsel of arms. Crouch down and lick the hands which feed you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that you are our countrymen." Unfortunately, in America today, people seem to be becoming more and more tepid about their freedom and more intent upon replacing it with whatever they consider to be better for the good of society. Therefore, when I look at America today, I have to wonder what John and Samuel Adams are thinking now. This concludes our telling of the true events of April 19th, 1775, the day of the shot heard round the world. The 8-year war that ensued was frankly too horrible for most of us here today to imagine. So long as we remember what the founding generation sacrificed, so long as we maintain the freedoms that they secured in our stead, then they are not gone. Their struggle was not in vain. However, should we fail to do as instructed and maintain our freedom by participating in the political process handed down to us, then we do not deserve our freedoms, and we will surely lose them. You see, a society of sheep eventually begets a government of wolves. Now, let's get back to preserving freedom with another AQT.